director of the National Resource Center on Children and Families of the Incarcerated, or NRCCFI, at Rutgers University, Camden, New Jersey, where she also teaches in the departments of sociology, anthropology, and criminal justice. Under Anne's leadership, NRCCFI has provided training and consultation to government and non-government agencies and community programs worldwide, including the National Institute of Corrections, Urban Institute work on model practices for parents of prisons and jails, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, their Safeguarding Children of Adolescent Parents resources, Sesame Street's Little Children, Big Challenges, incarceration materials, and has many publications, with the most recent being 12 Guiding Principles for Responding to the Needs of Children and Families of the Incarcerated, which was published by Cambridge Scholars Press in 2018. Anne was honored by the Obama White House as a champion of change for her work as an advocate for children and families of the incarcerated. For the last 2 years, Anne has consulted with Maryland Governor's Office for Children to provide training and technical assistance to Maryland counties serving families impacted by incarceration. The second presenter is Jasmine Paxson. She is the program manager for Talbot Mentors in Easton, Maryland. Jasmine was also impacted by parental incarceration as a child. With that, I'll turn the webinar over to Anne.
And welcome, everyone. Just be patient as we're trying to get the slides moving. Okay. So thanks everyone for logging on. And I wanted to just give a real brief introduction to planning this webinar. We did a survey of all the 24 counties through the LMBs and had an extraordinary 66% return on our survey. And so we're really paying attention to the fact that people were pointing us toward including primarily research on trauma and ACEs as it relates to children with incarcerated parents, resilience theory, and then specific strategies. So that's what informed the planning of this webinar and how we're planning to move forward today. And then I've also infused what I've been using over the last 2 years for a lot of my work, which is the 12 Guiding Principles for Responding to the Needs of Children and Families of the Incarcerated, a chapter in a book that I wrote that was published in 2018. And just basically those 12 guiding principles are to be self-reflective, to include experts with lived experience in the work that you do, to recognize the themes and variations in families, to use only accurate data about intergenerational incarceration, to clarify the use and interpretation of research, to recognize the impact of trauma and toxic stress, especially and specifically for families impacted by incarceration, recognize resilience and strength-based approaches and protective factors, honor the significance of the incarcerated parent, advocate for purposeful programs and relevant supports, create atmospheres of safety and trust in order to combat the stigma, some of the media portrayals, collaborate with each other. We won't go into each of these in depth, but the notion of them is woven through the webinar. So we'll start with number 1, which is to be self-reflective. Love Aristotle's quote that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And all of your opinions and feelings about incarcerated parents and their families and their kids will come from your experiences, your education, but also just some basic, almost primitive theories and thoughts and opinions and perspectives that we all have. So I want to take a few minutes to have everyone think about that. And I'm not asking you to answer this out loud, but I'm asking you to answer it inside of your head. What do you see? You see this picture. And most people say that they see a child looking like she's being left out with 2 kids whispering, maybe bullying her. And what's important is that a lot of times when I show this to kids, The kids will say, sometimes they'll say that, but a lot of times they'll say, well, it looks like maybe they're playing this game where they have to act stuff out like charades, and one's telling the other one what to do, and the other girl is waiting, and she doesn't like being the one to guess, and she's afraid she's going to get it wrong. Or maybe she just learned that her cat is really sick and is going to get put to sleep that day. So that maybe her reaction is unrelated to the other two girls. But what we see is colored often by our own experiences. So people who have been bullied are going to see bullying in the picture. And the second thing is, who do you identify with in any given situation? And, many of us who are parents identify with the woman with her head in her hands, as the two youngsters in the background look like they're going to kill each other. But one person in a group once said, "My two kids are taking Taekwondo and they're constantly practicing on each other. I get migraines." So what I saw was a woman with a migraine and the kids being loud. So identifying with either the kids or the mom. And in our work, we are going to identify a lot of times with the kids, sometimes with the incarcerated parent, sometimes with the caregiver parent. So knowing what our perspective is really, really critical. And it's why I wanted you to go through those brief activities. A comedian once said he was trying to explain to his grandmother, who hadn't finished third grade, why he was getting a doctoral degree in philosophy. And he said, philosophy is like ideas, Granny, the study of thoughts and ideas, like is the glass half empty or half full? And she sat back in her rocker and she said, well, doesn't that depend on whether you're drinking or pouring? Which I think is pretty profound for someone that didn't finish the third grade. But it's also really relevant to what we're about to do, because many of us serving the families are pouring, and many of the people taking advantage of our services or coming to us for help are drinking. And the perspectives are going to be different on a lot of the work that we do. So now we're going to do a poll, and going to ask you to think about these two questions. The best thing that could happen to children with incarcerated parents or impacted by incarceration, and the worst thing that could happen. And I'm going to ask Chris to take over with the poll.
Hey everyone, so give me just one moment to pull up our poll. You should see a poll pop up on your screen. There are two questions. And the first being, what is the best thing that could happen to children with incarcerated parents? If you could go ahead and answer those two questions, we'll go ahead and tabulate the results and share them. Question being, what is the worst thing that could happen to children? It looks like we have 8 of 12. And the results are that majority of folks feel as though the best thing that could happen to these children is that they have supportive friends and family. Majority of folks feel as though the worst thing that could happen to these children is that they cannot find relevant support or help. And may have some interpretation of those poll results. We'll give Anna a second to transition.
So it kicked us off completely.
All right.
The screen just kicked us off. So I
Hopefully
will.
you hear the poll results. Hopefully you're able to hear the poll results.
I didn't hear the poll results. You're seeing my screen?
Not. You're going to want to share content and reload your PowerPoint.
Okay, so what were the results of the poll? Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties, always the case.
That's all right. Most folks felt as though the best thing that could happen to children with incarcerated parents was that they have supported friends and family. And most folks felt as though the worst thing would be that these children would be unable to find relevant support or help.
Can you hear me, Chris? Okay.
I believe we can hear you just fine. Mm-hmm.
I love those answers, and they're really typical of community support folks and people on the outside, because that's what we do. You know, we want to provide them relevant support, and we want them to have supportive friends and family. 98% of kids that we ask say that the best thing that could happen is their parent reunited with a parent. There is a second part to that, a parent who is quote unquote fixed, and they use a version of that. At the core, at the heart of almost all kids impacted by incarceration, whether they have never met the parent, whether they were estranged from the parent, or whether they're so angry they don't want anything to do with that parent, at their core, the best thing that could happen would be that that parent somehow resurrected in a way that would parent them well. And that the worst thing, sort of the other side of that coin, their parent would die in prison and that they would never see them again. We didn't include the specific things that kids say in the poll results because it's not typically what the people in the community choose. So it's important, again, to think about that issue of perspective, whether you're drinking or pouring. And so on that note, I am supposed to be doing this with Jasmine Paxson because Jasmine really does use her personal experience to inform the work she does with young people here in Easton. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jasmine on her perspectives about assumptions.
So I was impacted by parental incarceration. My father was incarcerated from my age of 3 to 11 years old. And because of the assumptions that I heard from other people and the bullying that I experienced in my past, I personally do not share as an adult about my experience as fear of having those things happen again. So I tend to share my experience in relevant situations really to protect myself. And I see this with our caregivers when we do our intake interviews. They're hesitant to speak about if incarceration is an issue for their family, and they're worried that maybe we as an organization will judge them or treat them differently.
And I did some work last night with caregivers here with Jasmine. Jasmine told me, is it okay if I say, that when she was speaking with the hat of the professionals, she was feeling very differently than when she was speaking the hat of personally impacted. And so it all rests on this issue of what we think the assumptions are that people are making out there. And I'll also share with folks that I'm in my 40th year of doing this work and started in 1979. And in 2013, my son-in-law was arrested and incarcerated for the better part of a year in a different state. My daughter and son and grandchildren came to live with me. And so all of a sudden, after 30 some years of knowing about something, I knew it because I was living it. And the it really I wasn't able to access fully. The judgments, assumptions, and shame and stigma that unless you walk in those shoes, you really don't. Now I want to take time, I want to reiterate what Chris said earlier about this webinar being archived, because often people say, folks that I did training and technical assistance in 18 counties last year. And so often people say, well, we have had a staff turnover rate and new people, et cetera. So this will be something that may be repetitive for some of you, but it will be good to use to bring new staff up to speed or just to refresh your own knowledge. So I'm going to briefly go through some of the things we do know, moving from assumptions to facts. It is estimated that 0.7 million kids in the United States have an incarcerated parent. See, 1.7 doesn't include jails. It only includes state and federal facilities. You also might see over 5 million. That means at any point in their lifetime, not just on any given day. 2.7 million is on any given day. Over 5 million is over the course of their lifetime. And over 10 million includes more than just incarceration. It includes other forms of criminal justice supervision like probation, parole, house arrest. We also know that the red bar is incarcerated fathers. The royal blue is all parents, and the sort of turquoise color blue is incarcerated mothers. And we know that most children impacted by incarceration are impacted by having a father incarcerated. Most of those kids live with their mothers. And our research shows that most of those kids are unknown to any public system. They're not in child welfare. They're not in juvenile justice. The schools don't know. They're really under the radar because many times the mothers have moved on. They have new partners. They're in college. They're working. They don't really want to keep going back and revisiting this. And it truly is an issue that the kids tell me when I do get to access them that they suffer in silence. The smaller columns over to the right of the screen are for foster care, other friends and family, and second from the left are grandparent caregivers. Most of the children of incarcerated mothers live with grandparents. But one of the things that also we know is that many of those children lived with their grandparents and their mothers anyway. So when the mom goes to prison or jail there, and those are the kids that are not as displaced in residence as some of the other kids are. We also know that close to half, maybe not, maybe even more than half, of these kids are under 9. And so many of the programs out there are for kids 8 and older. And we really need to keep thinking about how to reevaluate services for and training for those programs serving infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. Keep in mind that all of this is guesstimating, that there is no system in Maryland or anywhere that actually counts heads. Detention centers don't ask, the state facilities don't ask, but not as a group. Not ready to say schools should ask because schools, we're still seeing too much research about bias in schools. We're encouraging child welfare systems to ask if incarceration is an impact. Our second webinar on November 18th will go into much more depth about the discussion of data collection. Right now, we use a formula and random sampling and a formula. But one thing that isn't a guesstimate is that compared with their white peers, African American and Latino kids are over 7 and 2 times more likely, respectively, to have an incarcerated parent. Linking this back to being self-reflective, I want each of you to ask yourself what meaning you make of this, because people will make different meanings. There are people who will say it's poverty, people that will say, honestly, there are people who think that people of color are inherently more criminal. There are people who think that it's because of racism in the systems of law enforcement and child welfare and schools. We know that there's significant amount of racism in the systems, and we know that from lots of substantive research. We do not have any research that corroborates an inherently more criminal population. But this is also about perspective and what people hear and see when they talk with families and plan for families. using combined sources of research, because we're getting much more research now every single day on the impact of incarceration, and using sort of combined sources, all points to the unique toxic stress of parental incarceration. The shame and the stigma that Jasmine talked about in several variations for people who were kind of expecting it because of where they live, because everybody gets locked up, or because of situations in the families. That's a kind of shame and stigma that comes from, I thought we wouldn't escape it. It's all around us, but I thought my family wasn't going to end up there. And then the shame and stigma from families in communities where incarceration either isn't or isn't ever known or talked about and really hidden is a different kind of shame and stigma. But all of it leads to the conspiracy of silence, of not wanting to tell, that leads to isolation. Whether you're telling your kids not an untruth about where the parent is, or whether you're telling them the truth and telling them not to tell anyone, but it all leads to isolation. Residence and family structure are really common for almost all kids dealing with incarceration. The decrease in family income can range from 20 to 50%. Difficulty maintaining relationships with the incarcerated parent. Fear and worry that kids have about both their incarcerated parent and their caregivers. Loyalty conflicts, like who do I love? If I love my caregiver parent, the incarcerated parent is unable to parent me and I feel bad and I want to be loyal to him or her. And, just developmentally, there are kids, different ages where kids choose one parent or the other. So for the caregiver parent that's, sort of spending each day sweating and slaving to raise these kids, to have them say, well, I don't want to listen to you. I want my dad, or I want my mom. Those loyalty conflicts cause real distress in households. The guilt and self-blame that kids feel is just palpable, whether it's real because of the 3-year-old who answered the police's question, do you know where your dad is? And he said, yeah, he's in the closet, all the way up to, why wasn't I enough to get my mom to stop using drugs? And everything in between that kids are blaming themselves. Trauma from the sudden absence of the parent. We just are beginning in the trauma research to include the separation because of incarceration as a trauma. Up until the last 3 years, people haven't included that separation as traumatic. And then the lack of relevant supports, because people still are afraid to have focus on incarceration in groups and in conversation. They're afraid of outing kids. They're afraid of making pointing in the direction of kids. So they instead have generic grief groups or basic skills groups to help with emotional competence without making it specific and relevant to their circumstances. And then we all know about school behavior and performance difficulties that these kids are experiencing. Jasmine, what kind of impact are you seeing both in the kids you work with and just remembering for yourself?
So definitely for myself, I really remember that feeling of guilt and shame, and really feeling different from the other kids. Definitely didn't talk about it. And I felt like if someone asked me where my dad was, you don't want to answer the question. And that makes you feel like, okay, what's wrong with me? What does that mean about myself? Not really that this isn't related to me and I don't need to take on that shame or that guilt. Our staff, we can definitely see the impact of incarceration on the youth we serve when we receive referrals from the school system that indicate behavior and performance issues. So in my head, I definitely relate that, okay, they're acting out this way in school because of this trauma. But a lot of times when the parents come in to talk about the children, they don't always see the correlation between the behavior and the trauma of incarceration, just because maybe they're not aware of that connection. And our mentees in our program really don't open up much to us as staff about their feelings around incarceration, but are more able to open up with their mentors who they're seeing on a weekly basis.
And so you're moving from, yeah, the impact informing the kinds of services that kids need to be able to open up about it, to sort of rise above the assumptions and the judgments. And the point you made about that people around kids are not making the connection between the behaviors and so I want to talk about that a little bit, because one of the best things that happened this movement is when people realized that incarceration was one of the ACEs. This ACE study, Felitti and Anda did this study in the 90s with middle-aged men looking back at their childhoods and noticing that those people that had 3 or more of these specific adverse childhood experiences were experiencing much higher rates of physical health problems, things like heart disease, things like stroke, diabetes, and other kinds of illnesses. And so they basically, the study went sort of unheralded, except in adult medicine, many decades, until about 8 years ago, when pediatricians started to say, I worry about it when the people are middle-aged. Let's look at it in pediatric healthcare. Well, one of the difficulties, and the ACEs are a helpful tool for us only because it put incarceration on this list of things that happen to children that are traumatic. And why ACEs matter is because of the trauma. Every one of these adverse childhood experiences, every one of them, causes or is exacerbated by, or really is caused, they cause trauma. Except for parental absence in some cases, such as a separation or divorce that is congenial and children are always seeing their parents. So it's the loss of a parent, either temporarily or permanently, that causes this level of trauma. It's really important for us to look at ACEs matter because of trauma. Trauma is the feeling that something is life-threatening, and it releases cortisol in the brain in large amounts. And when it's large amounts over long periods of time, changes the architecture of the brain. That's the simple version of a traumatic response. The behaviors that it causes, this cortisol flooding, are impulse control, lack of cause and effect, or the limited capacity to anticipate consequences, lack of social cueing, or the lack of predictability, the difficulty regulating emotion, can't calm down or delay gratification, inability to be reciprocal in engagement. I talk, you listen, you talk, I listen. You have a kid, impulsive, that doesn't understand if I do this, this will happen. That can't understand that dirty look somebody just gave them is telling you to stop. They can't calm down when their feelings are ratcheted up. Talk over you all the time. They lead poor school performance and increased dropout rates. The trauma-informed world, we're learning and getting lots of good trauma training, and so are other systems. And we're learning to say things like, what happened to that child instead of what's wrong with that child. And that's really helpful. And trauma-informed everything is kind of everywhere. But what people are not recognizing is that attachment disruption trauma, specific kind of trauma, comes from the sudden loss of the primary caregiver parent. And it causes seek attachment, leads to gang involvement and, unfortunately, early pregnancies, because kids will trade affection for affection when they have this need for attachment. Put an attachment disrupted kid in the wake of a sexual predator, it is never, ever, ever the kid's fault. But you've got problems when kids are wanting to latch on attachment figure. All of this can lead to self-medicating in the wake of this trauma and toxicity, which leads to drug use, abuse, and addiction. So it is crucial that we understand each of these aspects of trauma in kids and that we also understand that the research is really helping us with this attachment disruption as trauma. Victor Carrion at Stanford University talks about the fact that young children, specifically kids under 5, have really different definition of a non-permanent sense of life and death and a different definition of life threatening. He says that if an attachment figure is suddenly unavailable to a young child, their cortisol level, their level of threat is as the same as ours would be if someone walked into a room and held us at gunpoint. And so to understand that level and to those adults around them. So they may think baby in the crib didn't know. But the cortisol flooding happened because they felt endangered. It affected the brain architecture, and the child is now 8 years old and having lots of trouble in school. Or he never knew his dad, but the toxic stress in the household was so palpable that by the time he's 10, he's so angry and so acting out, but doesn't want anything to do with the parent, but it can be traced back to this trauma. The other piece of this is witnessing the arrest of the parent intensifies the loss and causes additional trauma. And we know that something like 64% of kids do witness the arrest of their parent. Brand new information out of the American Academy of Pediatrics that I didn't have time to put on the slide. Children's health. This link here is to an NPR audio session that's really quite helpful, understanding how racism is trauma, families of color. So toxic stress is also trauma, Harvard tells us. So it's not just a traumatic event or just the racism or just the incarceration, but persistent fear and anxiety affects young children's learning and the developing architecture of the brain. And that can be due to poverty, parental depression, and all of that can be as toxic as an event or a specific. We know that the toxic stress of incarceration is a lot about economics, that more than half of the parents provided primary financial support for their families, that families are more likely to receive public assistance, are high. One study found that family income levels during the years of incarceration drop by more than 25%, and another study that I referenced earlier is up to 50%. One of the things that families are really dealing with now is that if they go to get assistance or other benefits, and they were getting child support, the incarcerated parent will have to pay the state back, and that's true in Maryland as well, when he or she gets out, as well as paying the parent back, and or paying, continuing or beginning to pay child support to the family. And we're really supportive of families getting child support. We really want us to consider the realism of it for someone who gets out of prison, tending to go back to illegal employment to get out of this child support dilemma. We also know the criminal justice system itself can be toxic. The families are telling us not only the arrest, but the pre-trial anxieties and frustrations, the sentencing for families that are intact when this happens. There's hopelessness and helplessness. Then there's sort of 2 stages during the incarceration. The first one is about abandonment and stigma and the loyalty conflict and fear, worry. Then later on, they get angry and resentful. And then they start finding a balance, and long sentences often result in kids idealizing their parent, putting them on a pedestal. That's really hard for the families around them to hear. Pre-release can sometimes have fear and anxiety and anticipation, and families tell us that the reentry period post-release is the hardest stage. My family, my daughter and my son-in-law, with all of their family supports and knowledge from me, were telling me they're not going to have a hard time when he gets out. Really did. And they did. And so they had gone on without him for a year, and he was feeling, he had been the primary caregiver parent and was feeling really like that role had been taken away from him, and he was trying to get back into it. And we hear that quite a bit from families. So we can't forget the reentry period in all of this work. So going back to the ACEs, people are starting to add ACEs to Validity and Anda's original list. And some of these are really apply nicely to the secondary effects of parental incarceration trauma. The bullying that Jasmine talked about, the poverty, rejection, racism, other deaths and losses that seem to be more prominent in these families. Someone told me the other day that both her daughter and her brother passed away from overdoses in the same week. Community violence, food scarcity, experience of care, and living in unsafe environments. But we do know that children with incarcerated parents impacted by incarceration experience other adverse childhood experiences and more of them than other kids. So they have economic hardship, parental separation or divorce, parental death, domestic violence, neighborhood violence, mental illness, substance abuse, and racial discrimination in higher proportions than other kids. These have been negative sense that they have been interpreted as abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction by most people talking about them. And that's a problem for us because if you talk about incarceration and mental health issues and addiction as household dysfunction, and then in the next breath, talk about reunification programs, you have people in politics and in programs that say, why do we want to support reunifying these kids with their parents when parents' behavior caused the problem? So the Office of the Arizona Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family, they tried to sort of come up with an optic that looks a little different, putting some of the ACEs as the tree on top of the ground with some of the other toxic stressors underneath to make it look like there are some causes of some of these things. And the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Healthy Steps program for young children at Boston University Medical School, or it was at Boston University Medical School, put it this way. There's abuse, there's neglect, and then there's household challenges. Mother treated violently could maybe go in the abuse or neglect column or a household dysfunction, but the other things, when viewed as household challenges, make it easier to support the families. Incarcerated parents list of health behaviors or health conditions: depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, asthma, obesity, speech problems, hearing problems, the whole list. The no column is not have an incarcerated parent. Yes column is I do. And the incidence of these health issues doubles with incarceration, with the exception of diabetes. That's the only one that stays the same. So these health problems are stress and trauma caused, stress and trauma exacerbated. We need to be really careful about reading the research, though. The newest research out there from just a few months ago in the Journal of American Medical Association says that children who have a parent in prison are at risk, more than twice as likely as other kids, to have depression, attention problems, also drop out of school, wind up in jail, use illegal drugs, suffer from anxiety and social isolation. It's really important for us to say, why might this be true? Now that you have some of this other information, it's not that they're just following in their parents' footsteps, but all of these things can be traced to trauma because there are myths that children of incarcerated parents are 7 out of 10 or 5 to 6 times more likely to go to prison or jail. This new study says that they're 2.8 times likely. But there's flaws in this new data. First of all, it's based on 1990s. It's not current, even though it was just published. It's a pre-mass incarceration population from Appalachia, which is a specific population. They do not connect it to trauma and ACEs. Remember, this is really important. Whenever you see that children impacted by incarceration help and services, someone has to be diagnosed. I'm a child and family therapist by training. I have a small private practice. If people come to me because they want to talk about how to talk to the kids, how to minimize their anger, to tell the truth, how to prepare them for visits, if I want to get paid, I have to diagnose someone in the family with a mental health condition. And those of you in schools know that to get services, kids have to have a diagnosis. I'm not saying they don't have some of these things, but we're very quick to put a conduct disorder or attention deficit disorders or other labels on kids, and they're not scientific diagnoses like with blood tests. They're observations by teachers and parents that are coded, and so they're very subjective. It gets shown. Remember that a lot of the time it is related to diagnostic. But the most important piece of this is that repeating this myth and these myths compounds the shame and stigma that children of incarcerated parents feel and their caregivers, and all the things that we were talking about and Jasmine was saying and families have said about assumptions. We are seeing intergenerational cycles, and we have to talk about it. We have to talk about the why before we talk about the how. Is at the core of some of this. Redlining in housing and job issues and hiring practices have caused marginalization all the way back for decades, causing poverty, causing the trauma and toxic stress, and arrested at greater rates than other people. Because then behaviors that come from trauma that we talked about earlier are interpreted often through a racial lens. Know that Black and brown kids are sent to alternative schools more than Caucasian kids. We know that they're kicked out of preschool at different rates. We know a 6-year-old in Florida recently was handcuffed and arrested for a temper tantrum at school. And so we really have to examine this before we just sort of knee-jerk say it's an intergenerational cycle. So that was a lot on trauma and all that contributes to it. What do you think, Jasmine?
So I personally have a high ACE score. And I remember when I was first learning about the ACEs professionally, I felt a real ability to back my and not having to judge myself so harshly for some of the things or behaviors that I experienced as a child. I also experienced many of those secondary effects and poor health outcomes as well that I really didn't understand was a direct correlation to that trauma. I still find that sometimes in listening to others share their stories, be re-traumatizing, but it's nice to be able to know that they're not alone in what they're going to. So even though it's hard for me sometimes, I know that I can be an outlet for that other person. Don't feel as alone. And then really here at Telementors, we're focused on building resiliency in our mentees. So we know that they've faced this, but what can now to create resilience?
So we're going to talk about resilience theory in a minute, but I want to stay on the trauma for a second. I'm really resonating to when you were saying about being re-traumatized. One of the things we talk about a lot is having people in programs, people who were formerly incarcerated, people who were caregivers, and people who are adult children, really helps the program to be to put on a face of we really get it, and that tendency to hire personally impacted folks to bring families to you more, and we're going to talk about that in the next webinar a little bit. The flip side of that is the re-traumatization that can happen to people who have experienced trauma. the need to be sure to take care of yourselves. And so how do you do that?
Self-care, I would say self-care is very important in this work, and definitely not even in relation to this specific trauma. Like I said, I had a high ACE score, so there's a lot of things that I hear daily that can bring up a lot of feelings for me personally. And I would just say trying to relax and deep breaths. I have essential oils that I use. There are definitely things or times where I can let the rest of my staff know, hey, I need to take a break for a second. I'm just having a hard time with this. There's a lot of feelings coming up and being able to excuse myself. So I think there's definitely a point being open with your other staff members if there's something that they might not know why it's bothering you. And even if you're not able to talk about it fully, just let them know. I can relate to that, so I need to step away.
Summer and in a program for children with incarcerated parents, they had a room and the sign on the door could be changed to tell people what was going on in the room. It was a breastfeeding room, but if you turned the sign around, it was called the breathing room. And in there, they had essential oils and candles. People could go in and debrief themselves, or check in with themselves. And I thought that was really pretty important because they were doing a lot of post-trauma. The other thing that you raised before is this idea of not being alone. And I think that the traumatic effects of all of this, leading to the isolation that families feel of not wanting to talk about it, create this feeling of not being alone, which I think intensifies the trauma. To say is don't forget the caregiver. It really was striking to me all the way back. I was thinking, the trauma in these families is multi-layered and really significant. And so how did your mom?
My mom didn't really talk about it outwardly. She tried to answer my questions, I felt like the best way she could, but it was basically don't tell anyone. She didn't fill it out on forms to get any help for herself. She really kind of isolated herself, thinking she was protecting us as a family.
So in a minute, when we talk about resilience, I'm going to go back to the protective factors of family. But I also, just before we leave trauma, how does it work here, your agency, when you see trauma in the kids? How does that work? Do you refer them?
Yeah, so we definitely have referral systems to mental health agencies that we're able to pass the kids on to if they need additional help. Also, we have for our children impacted by incarceration in our program, we have support groups you can go to and meet with other kids that are also impacted. We have parent support groups, so definitely ways to help children and their families as well, kind of cope with some of the things that they're going.
Do you get involved at all with schools and other agencies that do have that block where they don't see the behaviors as trauma, but they see the behaviors as just kids, or the apple doesn't fall far from the tree kind of thing? Because we heard that last night.
Yes. So a lot of times our match support staff will go in and meet with the teachers to really explain to them, you might be seeing this behavior, but this is what we know about the family dynamics, so that they are able to see a larger picture.
And when we have the webinar on the 18th, we're going to dig into another issue that comes up now as you're saying that, which is really becoming a hot topic, which is confidentiality. And so do you have sign-off permission from the families to talk to the schools? Okay.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, we have permission to talk with the schools and any outside agencies if the family wants us to talk to a therapist, and help establish relationships with the mentor in that way with the school as well.
Well, I'm going to go to something you said earlier about focusing on strengths and resilience. Some of you may have seen this film that is in response to the ACEs. We're starting to see responding to the ACEs in a variety of ways. This film is brilliant, but it talks about the biology and the science of hope as well as the stress, but it doesn't mention parental incarceration at all, which is I find really true of most of the research on trauma and also on resilience. It's important to borrow from that film a statement that says no one who has experienced significant adversity is irreparably damaged, because the brain can repair itself with good experiences, with relationships, and with solid protective factors. David Satcher, who was our former Surgeon General, I think in the Clinton administration, said risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. And I love that quote, because I think we tend to look at these risk factors as predictive, and all of that myth stuff we talked about earlier leads us there. But we need to now switch and talk about a focus on protective factors. Recognizing protective factors, resilience research has been going on since the 1930s, and it boomed during World War II and post-World War II, the research on resilience, and has continued to be. We have studies only that even mention parental incarceration and resilience out of thousands on resilience. And so we're starting to encourage researchers to stop just looking at the bad things and start helping us see what the strengths are with these kids. But all of the research on resilience, all of it, boils down what is resilience to these categories. Resilient people have primary attachments. And in every focus group that I've done with caregivers, with kids, and with incarcerated parents, the first thing they say when I ask, how did you manage? What were your protective factors? The first thing that most people say is my family, my parents, my incarcerated parent, a lot of kids say, my caregiver, my grandparents, my cousins, my aunts, my brothers, my sisters. And then the other adult bonds, the people in the community, the mentors, the crossing guard. I've heard numerous crossing guard stories over the years. The youth group leaders, all of the adults in the kids' lives, teachers, counselors at school. One little kid said that they told her she didn't need to go to the counselor anymore because she was better, and she cried. They had allowed her to go see the school counselor whenever she was stressed out. And so now they were saying she didn't need it anymore. She was doing well. So, of course, she started having meltdowns again in the second grade because she kept wanting to go see Mrs. D. The skills and confidence that schools and youth organizations like YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs, music lessons and sports skills and academic skills and social skills, all of those things build confidence and promote resilience. Emotional competence. We're learning much more now about emotional intelligence, emotional competence. And a lot of times these kids need counseling to get at that. And that can sometimes be problematic because we're hearing stories every day about therapists that are just not trained to work with this population. They suggest that they should cut kids off from the incarcerated parent, that they shouldn't go visit without even knowing what the relationship was. Some kids really don't need contact if the crime was against them, if there was domestic violence sometimes and other things, certainly court sanctions. But many, many, many kids have relationships with the incarcerated parent. And so to have a bias against that in a therapeutic alliance is problematic. So we're really trying to help organizations work with their mental health people to understand better how to support the complexity of these relationships. Faith, hope, ability to find meaning. In all the groups, there's at least half of the group that talks about their religious faith or a strong sense of personal faith and competence, stuff that they learn from family about finding meaning in the world. Someone said recently in a group, I was just taught not to expect bad, not to expect good, just to take what comes and manage it and understand it. And some people would follow that up with, God's will or whatever it is that people have that brings that ability to find meaning. And finally, participation and influence. We know that when families and people and kids are involved in the planning of and the decisions about themselves and the programs we're giving them, that they come more often, that promotes resilience. So the rest of the research on trauma and toxic stress is that cortisol floods the brain and causes a problem. But dopamine is the other chemical that can also flood the brain. It's the chemical, whereas cortisol is and dopamine is. So we know that adults get dopamine surges from all things that make us feel competent, safe, and satisfied. Young children mostly get their dopamine surges from their parents. So their primary connections, their primary relationships. They don't have that arsenal yet that we have of, getting the promotion or finishing your master's thesis, actually sex and a good meal, a really delicious meal. I get a dopamine surge every time I work in Maryland because I get to eat the best crab ever. It's true. I'm just happy for the rest of the evening. But kids really get this well-being from the other attachments in their lives. So it's important to interpret this ACE research through a different lens. And in a presentation I gave at the White House in 2014, I said, when we talk about a child losing a parent to incarceration and we interpret the ACEs only through a child maltreatment lens, the meaning that gets made, intentionally or not, is that children of incarcerated parents are maltreated children, harmed by their parents, and thus better off without them. However, the parent in prison or jail is seen as potential support for the children, as a buffer from the toxicity of the stress, then a different meaning is made of the loss, and it becomes more profound and less dismissible. It's not true for all kids, but it is true for most kids. We can't just assume in either direction. We can't assume that the kids are helped by this incarcerated parent, and we can't assume that they're not. So go back to what you were saying, Jasmine, about resilience, both for you, for the kids you work with.
So definitely my mother was that person for me that was providing me that level of dopamine. And another major resilience factor I had growing up. So I was actually in this Tall Mentors program as a child. So being paired with a mentor who was another adult I was able to establish a bond with, who I could talk to and trust, was very helpful. And it's kind of different sometimes, obviously, than the relationship that you have with a parent, because this is the outside perspective, and maybe an unbiased individual. So as a program, what we really hope to promote resilience through is providing that additional caring connection of the mentor, providing a supportive environment. So our office space, our staff, therapy groups that we're able to provide, and then really promoting additional positive experiences, family trips for COIP families, so they're able to have a nice experience with that caregiver parent. I know you're saying like finances can be hard, so really being able to provide them an opportunity that they might not otherwise have, and then that the mentor-mentee activities where they're able to do things with that additional person, and then also meeting other children and having a fun time.
Some of the things that kids have told us, in 2016, we took 24 young people impacted by incarceration to Washington, D.C. from all over the country, talked to federal policymakers. And top of their list was no more generic grief groups. They really said, we want to be able to talk about this topic. They spent 3 days in Washington. We got some extra funding to give them. An anonymous donor gave them each a gift card to use room service at the hotel. Most of them had never flown. They were from 14 states all over the country. And at the end, they said the best thing about it, they got to meet Michelle Obama. They got to do all this great stuff, travel DC. The best thing about it was being with other kids by incarceration and only them. And on the boat trip we took along the Potomac, I was walking around and I was listening to them. They were all talking about, yeah, does that happen to you too? Does your mom say that too? And it was really very gratifying to see all the things kids have said about that coming true in that moment. There is some really good research that Denise Johnston and Megan Sullivan did a couple years ago that looked at resilience they looked at the whole picture, but in their resilience section, they talked about how many young people impacted by incarceration end up related to incarceration. They become advocates. And so one of their theories is that opportunity to advocate contributes to resilience. And we see that constantly. And we see now groups popping up all over the country. We Got Us Now is one that Ebony Underwood in New York has started with the help of John Legend. And we see groups, Pops the Club is a group in California that's a writing workshop in the Los Angeles high schools. And all of these groups are kids that are impacted by incarceration, but that are using their experience as advocates. And so I love the fact that you were a mentee in this program and now are a mentor and a very articulate advocate for these kids and families. So what part of that do you ever reveal that to the mentors or to the kids, your personal story?
So definitely around this topic, we've been doing training for our mentors so that they know that the mentee they're serving is impacted by incarceration. And in those instances, I'm able to speak up about my personal experience and really allow them to understand the impact that they have. Sometimes they will never see that impact that they're having. And I'm just trying to let them know that your consistent presence is enough, regardless if the child is over, and like you were saying, the regulation with emotions, like they might not be outwardly very excited, but that doesn't mean that you're not contributing and providing that level of dopamine that they need.
So training for the mentors on that role that they play is really critical. Well, let's move to unmute our guests, Chris. And I'm going to ask you to think about how your initiatives are protective factors. And I'd like to just get one example, if I could, it's just in the interest of time, for each of these. So if, let me know when we're unmuted, Chris.
Everyone should now be unmuted.
Anybody have examples of how your initiative or program supports parent-child relationship with the incarcerated parent? Identify yourself before you talk. Okay, I'll give it a second. If nobody talks, we'll move on. Wanted to give people an opportunity. So one example that I can think of is a program that actually encourages the schools to send report cards home or send report cards to the incarcerated parent, of course, with the permission of the caregiver parent, and in some cases even have the parent call in for IEP meetings or other kinds of school-based meetings. Supporting that relationship with the incarcerated parent is the hardest one for Maryland programs, and it really does involve the detention centers and the prisons. It has to. So we'll talk about that a lot more on November 18th. How about supporting the caregivers? Anybody have examples of caregiver support? Participant. Example of supporting caregivers? I think that when I'm doing a series of focus groups around the state for the caregiver's guide that we're going to publish through the GOC at the end of the year. And what I've been struck with in 4 or 5 of them that I've done so far in 4 or 5 different counties is how the caregivers come to help sort of what they like about the guidebooks that are coming from Texas and Arizona. But what it ends up being is a support group for the caregivers. I think they probably wouldn't have come if it was called a support group in some cases. But caregivers really do need an opportunity to talk to each other as much as the kids do. All right, let's go on to the other adult bonds, which I think many of you are focused on. Anybody have examples of training for teachers or counselors about the impact of incarceration? Whether just not don't have anything and that's why they signed on for this webinar because they're not doing stuff yet, or whether they're not muted, or whether they're muted rather.
Folks have the opportunity to go ahead and mute again after we did the unmute all. And
Okay.
that's what's happening.
We are doing training for teachers and counselors in several counties here in Maryland. And as Jasmine said, you've done training here for teachers. So if anybody on this webinar is in schools, let us know if you have training, if you need training, because training for teachers and counselors is probably key. This other adult bonds. And then we have mentoring, which, you know, Jasmine's program is one, and there's a couple of really good mentoring programs in Maryland. And, you know, mentoring programs offer that other adult. And so one of the examples that one of the other mentoring programs shared is that they have this tricky balance they have to walk for some of the kids between, you know, being clear that they're not a substitute parent, but that they are an auxiliary support, an additional support. Do you have that struggle?
Yes. So we definitely make that clear to our parents when we bring them into the program that that's not what the mentor is. And then we also make it very clear to the mentor. I think sometimes before the mentors receive certain levels of training, they feel like, okay, I'm going to get this child with these problems and I'm going to be the one that fixes these things. So we have to set that boundary for them that they are not a parent, as well as just having them understand that the ACEs and the trauma are things that have happened or are going to happen, and your job is to not fix that or change that. Your job is to promote that resiliency.
Right. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. We've heard a lot of mentors say either that they were recruited with the idea that a very little bit could gain a lot of benefit. And so they were thinking that like an hour a month was going to make this major change. And when they realized how many issues and concerns they had for these kids, they felt overwhelmed. And then the other end of the spectrum was mentors who really signed on to like fix a family, and that was sort of what their motivation was. And so I think having good boundaries and good definitions of what the role is. How about after school programs, support groups, or parenting classes? Building skills, building confidence. Anybody have examples from your programs and or your communities?
Can you hear me? This is Jennifer Bertrand from the Somerset County Local Management Board.
Hi, Jennifer. Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Okay. Oh, good Lord. I thought I turned that off. I look like Not great. Okay. So I apologize if there's any background noise here. I'm at the library right now, but I wanted to share earlier about one of the things that we have in Somerset County, and it isn't necessarily through the local care team, but it is a resource that I have in my pocket where we've got for supporting parent-child relationships and supporting caregivers. Is we've got a reading program at the jail where the inmate reads a storybook and it's recorded, and they send it to the child. And the child gets to watch a video of their parent reading them like a bedtime story, and it also helps, promote the bond between parent and child, and it provides an additional support to the caregiver as well. But another thing that we do is, while we don't have anything that specifically addresses like identifying families who are incarcerated, like with my local care team meetings, if the family identifies that they are impacted by incarceration, we certainly work with them to, to support the family that's on the outside, but see if there's any kind of tools or resources that we can provide to the person who's on the inside as well. So I just wanted to toss that in.
People hear me now? Jennifer, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, so one of the things I'm going to suggest is when you're going to talk, make sure your video is turned off, because the video is interfering with the communication. But I think what Jennifer said was that they have a program where they read stories and or take videos, and I didn't get where. Chris, could you hear where she is from?
As the local care team coordinator in Somerset County. And,
Who does the videos? Is it a school or a community program?
community program is supported by the local management board. And those videos are transferred back and forth to keep that sustained line of communication between the incarcerated individual.
That's a great example of connecting with the incarcerated parent. Anybody else with support groups or parenting classes or after-school programs? Next one is empowerment and looking to the children and families to define the problems and design the solutions. Ask if anyone, I know one county, I'm going to be working with them to help build advisory board of children and families for their program. But does anyone have people, impacted folks on their directors, on an advisory council brought in to help define the problem and design the solutions? Okay, so we're going to talk much more about that on November 18th as well. But Jasmine, do you have representatives of personally impacted folks on any advisory group?
No, we do not. But in my head, as you were saying that, I was really thinking of the parents that we had us join us last night would be really great for planning out what our programs look like for next year in relation to that population.
Yeah, that's really a great idea. Move on. In an article in the about physicians banging the ACEs, they said the most vital step in creating a strong culture of resilience is involving members of the community. And I think statement in that article in 2017 really resonated to me, that unless you bring people in to talk about the things like violence and racism, and substance abuse into your school, into your program, into your agency, into your child welfare offices, and really hear from them what the issues are, you may be creating things that they don't come to. So participation and influence of the personally impacted, community supports and collaborations, training for systems, relevant skill building. We will talk about that in more depth on in the November webinar. So my sort of summary here is I use this sort of visual and literary kind of image of the arch. That attitudes are really important, and when you can do reflective supervision and you can do training that gets at perspectives and attitudes is really important. Relevance, it's important to really say programs are for and about the impact of incarceration. Honoring the complexity of these families, it is not one universal monolithic group. They're very varied. And healing. There is trauma deeply embedded in all of this work. Everything should have a healing backdrop to it. And we will, again, on November 14th, talk more about those strategies. So Jasmine, you get the final perspective.
So finally, I would say really work to understand the families and the children that you're serving. Really listen to them, allow them to share their story, and give them the space to express truly how they feel, and letting go and examining your own perspective and not holding judgment for them so that they feel comfortable sharing that space. So yeah, really letting go of the assumptions that you walk into the room with, and then having the ability to call yourself out when you realize you're having an thought or an assumption, and really question why this is coming up for you, what in your own past is bringing that to the forefront. Really building your program informed by the participants. So that was kind of what I said. So we do not have an advisory board how we are running the program, but when we designed the program, we sent out surveys and asked the parents what were some of the challenges they were coming up with and related to incarceration, and what kind of things they would participate in around incarceration. And a lot of it, so that's how we came up with providing the therapy groups, because they said their children needed therapy and outlets. We provided the parent support groups so that they could have a community amongst themselves. And the field trips that we planned, really they were saying, we want to be able to do things with our kids. Is there some way you guys could make that happen?
Great. Well, I have really appreciated all of your perspectives, Jasmine, all along the way since I've known you, but also specifically today. So this is the time for questions. We have about 10 minutes. Chris, did you get any questions? I couldn't raise up the chat box. Not so far. Does anyone who's unmuted have questions as we went along? Did you come up with questions that you have, or comments, thoughts?
Just been looking at alternatives to incarceration for non-payment of child support.
Someone?
Yes. Is there any interest in looking at alternatives to incarceration for non-payment of child support? Because that creates a really destructive cycle.
And this is Julie?
It's Lorraine, but I'm with Julie.
Okay. Great question. Child support issues are becoming sort of the new wave of interest and advocacy for these kids and families. I was just contacted by both the New Jersey and the New Mexico state departments of child support to look at training for child support workers. That's a little bit different. And we're also doing a 50-state survey of what each state is doing related to families impacted by incarceration. And when we got our initial survey results back, 4 states do have changes, legislation to change some of the child support issues. But I don't know about Maryland. So it is a question that I will record for myself to try to find out about. Does anyone on here know? Child support in Maryland, is it changing so that People are not reincarcerated for child support non-payment. The issues are the clock stopping when the person goes in or not, and then the reincarceration, and then also the repayment of TANF benefits. Those are the three typical issues that states are grappling with.
In my experience, the young man that I've worked with, he gets incarcerated. It impacts his ability to hold down a job. When he gets out, it's just a really vicious cycle. You know, he builds up a greater arrears. I don't see how he'll ever dig out of it. And then there's the further impact of his children, you know, being impacted by his continual incarceration. And he's really trying, but so many obstacles.
Yeah, and so again, it's not something we have paid specific attention to in the past, but I'm noting it as something to look at. Thank you for that question. There is a really good book that someone from Columbia wrote about child support, and particularly about fathers who are incarcerated, that I can look up as a resource if people are interested. All right, anybody else? Questions related to the material today? Share something they heard that surprised them, or something they heard that they really can use, information that they can put to use.
I thought the fact that the young people don't want any more generic grief groups was very enlightening.
Anybody else? Everyone is unmuted, I think, unless you muted yourselves. Anyone, the child support, but anything else that people would like information about that they didn't get from today?
Yes, hello, this is Kirk Martin. I did have a question on programs for interacting with the incarcerated parents. And I apologize, I have a parrot in my background that's talking, but you gave the example of the taped books and being able to provide that to families. Are there any other topics or successful ideas that you've heard about that seem like they'd be a really good idea to try to institute?
What kind of a program? Because I think they're program specific in a way.
I apologize. I'm a citizen member, so I'm not aware of what's.
Okay. So there are certainly the issue of books is something that public libraries have been donating books that they don't need or don't use. And there have been connections between schools and incarcerated parents where the schools are sending the reading lists of the child home, what they're going to read that year. And it is dependent on the caregiver being involved. The caregiver then can get those books from the public library sent into the prison so that her mom who's incarcerated can read the same book as the child. Of course, some of the obstacles related to that are at some point, some of the kids are at higher reading levels than the parents. It seems to be something that benefits everybody because now on phone calls, which is how most kids connect, there's something to talk about. You've heard, and so far that I know, nobody in Maryland is doing that. The one program in Dorchester County has a support group for the kids in the schools, and then a parenting class in the detention center that is run by the same program and the same people, so that there's like a connection. The difficulty, of course, is that most of the kids' parents who are incarcerated are not in the county detention center. They're either in another county or in a state or federal facility. Most of the incarcerated parents in the county detention center's kids are not in that school. So that kind of is an obstacle, but they have been doing wonderful things there in that connection. There's a couple of programs I know. There's a program that COIP house in DC that runs a program in the federal facility in Cumberland County, in Cumberland, that is, they do homework help with several of the federal facilities, helping, the guys are helping kids with their homework electronically. So they do a summer camp. Kids are brought to the federal facility in Cumberland for a 2-week or 10-day summer camp. And it's really remarkable. Those are just some of the things that we know. And we have time for one more question or thought.
I'm here.
Do you have a question, Cynthia?
No, not really.
Your name popped up, so I thought you might have had a question. We're coming toward the end of the time, and I always end with my favorite Einstein quote: "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." So I think that this work challenges us to think a little bit differently, have been, because some of the thoughts have kind of stuck ways to be reshaped, and we have to use some new thinking. And hopefully this webinar gave you some thoughts and some ideas for that new thinking. And I look forward to November 18th. We will have LMB directors and the director warden of the Dorchester County Jail Detention Center, and possibly one program provider on with us to talk about the practical issues related to running programs impacted by incarceration. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today.
And that next
Back to you, Chris.
that next event, I'm sorry, Ian, that next event is November 14th, beginning at 10:30.
14th, sorry, yeah.
The tech will be the same as today, and we'll also have a panel of presenters there. And thank you so very much, and definitely thank you to you as well, Jasmine. It's very impactful, and we're fortunate to have you joined today. So
You're welcome.
thank you to the participants as well.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.